Today, we're diving into a tough but really important topic: parenting while grieving. If you've ever wondered how to show up for your kids while also carrying your own heavy emotions, this conversation is for you. We're joined by Sarah Szymanowski, a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate and music therapist who has a real heart for supporting parents. Sarah's journey is incredible. She originally trained to be a cellist, but discovered her true passion was connecting with and helping people through music therapy. When Sarah became a mom herself, through all the joys and challenges of pregnancy, postpartum, and parenting three young kids, her focus shifted deeply into perinatal mental health. She went back to school, became a counselor, and now runs her own practice where she specializes in walking alongside parents through some of life's hardest seasons. She's here to share compassionate insights and practical strategies to help you support yourself and your kids when grief is part of your story. Welcome, Sarah. We always love talking to you. You're awesome.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks for the intro, and hello to Chrissy too.
Hi, Sarah. I'm really excited. I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm very happy to have you on the show today because this is a really important topic and it's not something we've covered previously. And unfortunately, it's something that we're all going to navigate in some capacity as a family. And I think it's important to have these conversations. Parenting is already such an emotionally demanding role. And moms in particular are often expected to hold everything together as we navigate these different challenges that come into our family. Why is it important to have a dedicated conversation about how grief affects mothers in particular?
What you said right there is that mothers are expected to hold it all together. I think that's a really key component of what differentiates grief in this phase in our lives versus another phase of our life. It's the expectation. Some of us, we don't want to see ourselves as super mom, but like society can have that expectation of us. And enter grief, which is extremely messy, which is extremely difficult to get a hold on without losing yourself a little bit in the process, and letting go of expectations, right? Because the more we try to hold on to grief or put a timeline on it or put I can feel this way but not in front of my kids, or I can feel, like, the harder it becomes. Now add on to that grief is not discussed a lot in society. This is you've had over 140 episodes. Congratulations, by the way. But you say that this is your first
Wow,
conversation
thank
directly
you.
about it. Yes, I'm excited for you guys.
I don't even know if I knew that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was looking at your history. I'm like, well, they really have created a great podcast where you do have difficult conversations and really important things to mom, but it is sort of a reflection of society that, you're not until your 140s, 150s in your episodes till it's like, ooh, we got to talk about grief. And so we have this societal taboo on it. And particularly, if you add grief that's connected to death, there is another societal taboo on that too. So if you have a mom who is going through grief or going through grief connected to a death, who has the expectations of society to hold it all together as a mom, this is a recipe for isolation. This is a recipe for feeling like you're doing things wrong. And we need to have the conversation about, specifically for moms, about this very human experience to get at the nuance of what it means to be grieving when you are a mom too.
It's so true, Sarah. You touched on some really important words in that whole statement that when you were talking. It's messy. So, so true. Letting go of the expectations. There are so many. I can think right now, not only of the expectations that moms have to hold it together, but the expectations society puts on men. to not show their emotions. And my brother passed away, and we experienced that when I was young. And I think I'm going to cry, but that was the first time I saw my dad cry.
Yes.
And it's so messy. And
Mm-hmm.
from that point on, it's like something changed in my dad. And now he's so much more emotional. Like he gets tears in his eyes when he says goodbye to his grandchildren, like he's so much more
Mm-hmm.
sensitive. But it was like that point in our lives when I saw that it was, you know, it was a societal taboo, I think, that he was faced with.
Yes.
This is such a hard topic,
Mm-hmm.
but many moms worry that if their children see them grieving, it might negatively impact the children. And again, I just had a situation where we lost our family pet. I was a mess.
Mm-hmm.
I was crying, and our girls were very uncomfortable with it. They've seen me cry before, but
Sure.
they still were like, Mom, I feel uncomfortable to see you cry. I don't like when you're sad. When are you going to be back to normal? Can you talk about what children actually need from their moms during grief, and whether expressing those emotions is harmful, or in some ways, if it's helpful?
Cindy, thank you so much for telling a little bit of your story. And I think just by doing so, it's a reflection of what I tell moms is that you've got to model this. We are teaching children how to be human. That is one of the most important roles as moms. And a part of the human's experience is grieving. And so by you showing your kids the messiness, by them verbalizing, I mean, that's so advanced too, verbalizing their discomfort with like, my mom's not okay right now, right? It maybe was a reflection of your own childhood, of seeing your dad and seeing him emote in a way you'd never experienced before. Your dad in that moment was teaching you what is serving you now with the loss of your dog, right? Is like your dad could model, like, it is okay to feel, it is okay to break down, it is okay to be messy because your daughters are going to need that in the future when society is telling them to bottle this up or to move on. Or let me talk a little bit about disenfranchised grief. Like, disenfranchised grief is like invalidation of your grief because it's for a certain thing, right? So like the often losing a pet is disenfranchised grief of like, uh, it's just a pet, you know, to have society telling you that, but your girls seeing you like really being in your feelings, like that is such a valuable lesson. Um, I like to talk about the opposite of what you've done, using an example from one of my favorite movie musicals.
Okay.
Okay,
Sounds good.
so have we all seen The Sound of Music?
Yes, absolutely.
So that is what not to do, right? The Captain Von Trapp lost his wife, his 7 children lost their mom, and his reaction was like the opposite of your dad's, right? I can't handle this. I have to be stoic. I have to put this away. And what that also does, it's going to tamper all of your emotions, including the love you're capable of expressing, including any joy. It's like you're creating this roadblock. And because grief is so strong and will sneak through if you let in any space, if you're trying to suppress it, you can't let in anything else. And so, I mean, that story was all about healing from that by letting in music, letting in joy, but also like you have to let in the vulnerability.
Thanks, Sarah, so much for that. As you were talking, something that came up for me as well was experiencing my children experiencing grief differently than,
Yes.
and they were constantly asking me questions about it. They're like, Mom, I don't feel like I need to cry.
Yeah.
And so just saying to them, Well, everybody experiences grief differently. And I think that that is one of those societal taboos that
Mhm.
they expect you to either shut it off and you just move on. Oh my gosh, they're so strong through all of this. Or you're a weeping mess and they're like, oh my gosh, she's broken, you know?
You actually touched on some research, some grief research there about grieving styles. So, way to follow your intuition and observe that in your kids. When psychologists were researching grief before, it was like, okay, how can we package this, right? And then we had the 5 stages of grief that were very linear. So I don't even talk about it that much because it's kind of debunked, right? The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Like we're going through these 5 stages. And uh, we can experience all of those things in grief, but it's not necessarily linear. It's not necessarily a pattern. Maybe you leave something out, right? It's because everybody's grief is so nuanced, but everyone's grief is valid. And what the grief researchers did find, though, is that there are a couple of distinct styles of grieving. And it sounds like your daughter's embodied that. So it used to be referred to as feminine grief and masculine grief. And then thank goodness someone said, oh, no, no,
Oh my
we're not
gosh,
going to,
thank goodness for sure.
yeah, we're not going to do that. But the terminology used now is intuitive grief and instrumental grief. So both of these grieving styles is like processing grief. Intuitive grief is what we think about in terms of the outward emotions, crying, weepiness, right? And being in touch and expressing these feelings. Now, an instrumental griever, it just because they're not showing, it doesn't mean they're not going through them. The instrumental griever is an example of this is a friend of mine who lost her sister to lung cancer, which is also what my mom died of. So I connected with her about this, but she showed up and created this team for the lung cancer walk that's held every year in November in DC. And her team is just like on fire every single year. I think they've been doing it for 12 years now or something, almost a decade, and have raised so much money. And she used her grief and her active grieving to create that project, right? That's what it was channeled in. We also see instrumental grievers like, the family's over after a funeral or whatever, and they're in the garage organizing the tools, right? Because that's what they need to express their grief. And it is not invalid and it is not wrong. A lot of us will experience maybe parts of an intuitive grief and parts of instrumental grief, right? Because again, there's no black and white about grieving. It is messy.
So important. And I love the information you shared about the instrumental griever because I think we all know those people
Mhm.
who don't respond with the tears and the weepiness initially, but they are the ones out there making the meals and getting the food train going. And there really are different ways of processing through these emotions. And it's important to recognize that and also to note that those people still need support too, still need a check-in, still need
Right.
a
It's
hug.
not like they have it all together or like the grief
Yeah.
is behind them or they're, healed, right? That we don't necessarily heal from grief, right? This grief it's almost like this thing. It think helps for me to think of it as a physical thing that you're just always carrying. And we learn to carry it. We learn to carry it and grow around it. But to think that just because someone is going through all of the boxes of their mother's things and donating them and organizing where they're going to go doesn't mean like, oh, they're over her death already. Like, no, this is a part of their process.
Thank you, Sarah, for what you shared about your mom. I'm sorry. Lung cancer is one of those ones that's really hard to watch. We lost my grandmother to lung cancer when I was 9, and I was raised by a single mom. So it was just me and her, me and my mom. And my grandmother was an integral part of our family unit. I I spent 2 months with her when I was 2 years old. I lived with her, not my mom, my grandmother. And I mean, she was a key part of our family. And when my grandmother passed away, my mom was really not okay. And I mourned my grandmother, but I also was very scared seeing my mom, and I didn't know what to do. And at 9 years old, it quickly became, in my mind, my role to make my mom happy.
Mm.
And that's hard to do when your mom is grieving the loss of her mother.
Mhm.
And I think that's a big part of my story and who I am.
Yeah.
It's a key part of how I show up in the world is this desire to handle things and make other people happy and feel okay, and I'll handle it in some way. And I think as a part of the sandwich generation, more and more of us, these we're moms now, we're going to start losing our parents.
Yeah.
And I often think about this in navigating this of how, and I also don't want to say in any way that my mom was doing the best she could, and being a single mom, it was all on her, and I try to put myself in her shoes, not having the support that I do, and how would I handle it. And so in no way did she do anything wrong. Of course, she had so much grief. Her mom was her best friend.
Mm.
I just don't know how losing a parent while you're raising children, it's just a whole other layer of complexity. And grieving as a daughter while still needing to show up as a mother. What unique challenges come with that situation? And do you have any practical strategies for any of our listeners that are facing this or will face this at some point that could help us navigate it?
I think this is why I have the focus that I do on parenting while grieving, specifically a parent. I will use this opportunity, I guess, to share a little bit more about my story, specifically with my losing my mother in my mid-20s. So I lost my mom to cancer before I became a parent. So fast forward a couple years down the road, I gave myself time to, because I hadn't taken the deep dive at that point. So I gave myself some time to heal, not knowing that getting pregnant would throw me right back into a major feeling and experience of grief, because you are assuming the role, whether it was your mom you lost, your grandma you lost, like your dad you lost, you had a caretaker, and you are now assuming that role. You are stepping into the role of the person that you're grieving. Or if you lose a parent while you're already parenting, the needing to continue to be in that role and be in that caretaker role, be in that, attachment figure role when you've been unmoored from your own attachment. It's going to pull up the feelings of just that very unique relationship in life. And I want to address to Chrissy what you were saying about the way you were worried about your mom, and go back to what I said about teaching your kid to be human. I think when we do worried, and your mom was probably really worried about how she was, feeling her feelings in front of you. When we lean into that and when we use that as a chance, even with really young kids, to explain why, to explain it's not their fault, to explain there's nothing we can do about grief. Grief is just something we need to sit with and hold, and oftentimes tell stories about. Instead of holding them in, the Captain Von Trapp thing, instead of suppressing them, to involve our kids in the process. So unlike your mom, the death of my mother happened before my kids were born, right? So a lot of when I would get pangs of grief, because she wasn't there, or because I couldn't ask her a question, or because something my kid did reminded me of her, right? I began leaning in to telling them stories. And that became a bigger project of like keeping remembrance and keeping, that attachment bond that I had to my mom, keeping that alive, even though she was gone, but keeping the importance to the love that still is there, keeping that alive and letting my kids see that. I kind of boiled it down to 4 things that I keep in mind as I'm going throughout my day, and maybe like step on a little shard of grief and want to talk to my kids about it. So one thing is keeping things around that are connected with the person that you're grieving, and intentionally putting them around. And those could be pictures. Yes, of course, that's a lovely way to keep remembrance. But like my mom's favorite flower was hydrangea. And here I have some dried hydrangeas sitting in my office. And so if my kid like walks into my office and like starts plucking at them or whatever kids do, right? I'm like, did you know that was Grand's favorite flower? And we'll have like a conversation about that, right? So things. And I know my kids are absorbing it because a sweet story, like hydrangea specifically, it reminded me of, I was having a moment on my mom's death anniversary. It was either her birthday or her death anniversary. Both are hard, right? And I told my kid, I was like, today is going to be a hard day for me because this is the day that Grand died and I'm going to feel sad. And so if you see that, it's not about you, it's me and just me feeling feelings and missing her. And my kid draws a hydrangea and
Oh
gives
my
it to
goodness.
me, right? So like those little conversations that happen in passing, just about objects, right? That becomes a part of their story too. And even though he has never met the woman, he's met the idea of her and has familiarized himself with her. The other way we do this is through traditions that we keep some things that I used to do with my mom, and we continue to do that, but I will always mention her that this was a thing that I did with my mom, and was this old. The other thing that keeps her a part of our daily conversation is traits, right? And none of my kids look like her, although like that could be something that you do share between your parent and a child, right? That someone has her curls or whatever, like keeping that alive in the conversation. For my kids, it's some quirks that I would be like, oh, grandma did that too. She really loved art. So if they're like really into a piece of art, I'm like, oh, did you see this? And that's tiny in things too. Did you see this painting that Gran did? Like, you're really getting the details like she did, right? So keeping her a part of that conversation. And involved in those 3 things, traditions, and traits, are the stories. But sometimes you can just have a story. I developed a fun game. I know we're talking about death, but I'm talking about fun too. You guys have played Two Truths and a Lie.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So playing that about the person you're missing in a way to tell stories and share with your kids to keep that remembrance there, even between these generations who may not know each other.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing those. I think that those are really powerful and very accurate, especially as you were talking about the hydrangeas. It's very sweet of your child
Mhm.
to draw that. It triggered something for me, and this is something I think my mom did really well, actually. When my grandmother passed away, someone had told her that when our loved ones leave, they come back in an animal form to
Mm.
check on us. And my mom decided that we had been seeing a lot of these huge black birds outside. And my grandmother was a nurse and like had these incredible, we all called her a witch. Like she had these incredible skills. Like she could like put her hand on an injury and she would draw the heat out and like it would feel better. It was magical. She was a witch. So it was very fitting for her to come back as a big black crow or a big black bird. So we have it in our head that is my grandmother. And my mom and I, we would go back and forth and we would talk about it all the time. And I can't even begin to tell you how many times to this day a big black bird shows up at the craziest times. I was actually just in Bryce Canyon. Sorry.
Okay.
With Noah for our anniversary. And I don't know what it is, but something about Bryce Canyon just speaks to my soul. The hoodoos, all of it, the story and the history is just really, I felt it. Like I pulled in and I got teary-eyed. There was something about it. And we're walking down, it's just Noah and I, and we're just walking down through the hoodoos and we haven't seen a single animal all day. We've been hiking for hours and Noah just points up and he's got like, hey babe, look at that bird. And it is this giant black bird. And to this day, I thank my mom for that because I feel like my grandmother is still with me. I remember seeing a big black bird when we were driving home from the hospital with Kira. And, you know, the mind can see it in all these different ways. I'm sure there's like a scientific something out there, but in my heart, I still feel connected to her. And I think that symbolism and those traditions and those stories are so important.
You built a lifetime of a bond with your grandmother, right? And so those little connections that we have, again, the bond doesn't go away. The love doesn't go away. So we call that a continued bond. Every time that you see that black bird is a continued bond with your grandmother. And just such a beautiful story. And like you said, a gift that your mom gave to you to point out like you can still have this bond with your grandmother and just look for the blackbirds.
I wonder as we wrap up this conversation, do you have any final thoughts, final statements that you could leave with a mom navigating grief?
But I wanted to take a moment to honor the complexity that is a parent-child relationship. You know, the moms that I see that come to me, whose moms are living, whose parents are living, we spend a lot of their session time processing that current relationship, right? And the stress. And, you know, in a lot of cases, developmental trauma. So that is another really important layer to parenting while grieving your own parent, because grief is not just sadness. Grief is not just missing that person. Grief is also dealing with really uncomfortable feelings, which makes grief that was already messy even messier. And so an important thing that I work with a lot of clients is like allowing yourself to feel anger towards the person who's gone. When you are a parent and you are facing a challenge with your kid, you're going to reflect on the way that you were parented. And a lot of times that leads to unrest in people, right? That like, I cannot believe my mom talked to me that way. I cannot believe my dad was such a yeller and caused me to be so anxious. You know, like making those connections, it's still important work and it's still allowed to do. And it can be very uncomfortable when our picture of grief is just like, okay, this is the acceptable feeling around grief, but I have so much anger showing up, right? Or I have so much fear showing up. Fear is one that I wanted to talk about, like with an uncomfortable feeling, because you may be, you know, coming up on an age where you lost a parent, right? And imagining that as a part of your story as a parent, particularly if there's an inheritable illness at play, to have that always on the back of your mind and a part of your grief story as one of those uncomfortable feelings that will come up. Another uncomfortable feeling that comes up a lot in the parenting space, parenting grief space, is jealousy. So if you've lost your parent and your mother-in-law is fine, right? The feelings that can bring up of like, why do I have to go to my mother-in-law with my baby questions when I just want to go to my mom, right? Or jealousy of other parents who have all four grandparents or maybe even bonus grandparents a part of their picture, and maybe you've lost one or both, or it could be up to you have no grandparents left for your kids. So those jealous feelings are really uncomfortable too, because you're like, wait, I'm not wishing death upon anybody. It's just a feeling that is wrapped up in grief, because grief is not just one thing. Grief is not a feeling in itself. Grief is an experience, right? I would also add that it's okay to let go of the four things that I was talking about, right? The things to remember your person by, right? Things, traditions, traits, and the stories that go with them. If they are not serving you, there is no reason why you have to continue a tradition. There's no reason that you have to bring up stories that are connected to pain. Like, it's also okay to let part of that go, or to throw out those dusty old flowers, even though like, but they were my mom's favorite. How can I do that? But if they're not serving you, like, giving yourself permission can be hard sometimes. But so I wanted to have that as to go along with, how to remember someone by.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think, first of all, thank you for holding space for both Cindy and I.
Definitely.
And
Thank you.
thank you for sharing your own experience with grief. I think that, as with everything, every traumatic occurrence, every grief that we go through, there is power in sharing our stories, and in hearing the stories of others it can be healing. So thank you. And thank you for bringing this very important topic. I'm sure this might be a hard episode for some people to listen to, depending on where they are in this process, but hopefully it can really help some people. I think you gave us a lot of really great pieces of wisdom to walk away with. And I would love to also have you share a bit about you, more specifically how people can work with you, because you work with people virtually and are able to help them navigate grief in particular.
Yes, this is a special population. I can work with all kinds of grief, right? And I didn't define what grief was, but grief can be, a loss of identity, a loss of autonomy. Grief can be, a transition that feels uncomfortable. It's so many things that are a part of motherhood in general. Like, so I would say, like, for most of the work that I do with moms, even if there's not a death or an obvious thing to grieve, like, there is some grief involved. And but in particular, holding space for the experience of grief is such an honor in the work that I do, because it involves trust, it involves vulnerability, and it involves the acknowledgement that I can't fix anything. And honestly, neither can you. It's learning to deal and hold that loss. So it's very different than if you come with very specific, like a diagnosis of depression or a diagnosis of anxiety, where we work on things and set goals to improve symptoms and things like that. And that can be part of working through grief, right? If you're experiencing those clinical levels. But grief in itself is not an illness, and it's not something that needs to be fixed, but it's something that I hold space for the moms that I work with, so that their suffering from the grief decreases. And yeah, I run Fermata Counseling. It is virtual. a virtual therapy practice in North Carolina. I love working with moms, but holding space for anybody going through this work is important.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Sarah. It was very important, and we're glad that we were able to have it with you.
Yes, I thank you.
It's been such an honor. Thank you, Sarah.